Katie.
All right, Ryan, I want to ask you about one brand new senator, Jim Justice, used to be the governor of West Virginia. Back in 2017, he sent a pretty firm letter, pleading letter to Senator Capito, who is also a West Virginia senator. And he was talking about Medicaid cuts. He was very concerned about it. He says, since so many of our people count on Medicaid, any cut to Medicaid would destroy families in West Virginia. We can't put the 175,000 West Virginians who benefit from the Medicaid expansion at risk of losing coverage. The consequences would be catastrophic. He talks about the drug epidemic, fewer people having access to drug treatment programs. He talks about how it's also concerning that the state legislature cut $54 million from West Virginia's Medicaid budget back then and backfilled it with voodoo, he says, one-time money, calling it a total shell game. So Jim Justice was pretty passionate about losing Medicaid back in 2017. Is he as passionate today now that he's a senator?
Well, the short answer is no, Katie. And it's interesting the way that they're framing these cuts now. And it just demonstrates the difference between being a senator and essentially handing down these mandates and handing down funding to the state level versus being a governor where you actually have to implement those cuts or implement the funding of this program. And so far, Justice has been very concerned and has talked kind of broadly about the idea of Medicaid cuts, but he hasn't specifically come out and said that he's a no vote on this bill because he's concerned about those Medicaid cuts. And what Republicans that have attempted to do is try and frame the contours of this bill as actually reforming Medicaid, that they're simply just getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse and actually making the program stronger. But every independent analysis of these cuts demonstrates that people are simply going to lose their coverage. And the range is anywhere between 5 and 8 million people that could lose coverage as a result of it. They don't want to own that part of it. And I think that's where you find the divide right now between people that are firm yes votes and those that are still concerned and holding out a yes or no vote at this point.
Really interesting about Jim Justice. Vaughn, as I said a moment ago, ultimately the decider here is going to be President Trump. He holds so much power over this Republican Party. He keeps tweeting no cuts to Medicaid. He's made big promises, no cuts to Medicaid. How does he define no cuts to Medicaid?
Right. I think that's the difficulty here, as Ryan just suggested, is that you can say no cuts to Medicaid, but one of the requirements that is a part of this measure would force individuals to prove their eligibility every 6 months instead of every year. And so you're looking at individuals potentially losing their Medicaid because of paperwork issues here. But also this White House, though, is really making the argument here politically that if you file your paperwork, if you are working 80 hours or volunteering 80 hours a month and you're able-bodied, then there's nothing to be worried about. You still are eligible for Medicaid. They are arguing that part of this reconciliation package would reduce funding to states that provide Medicaid to undocumented immigrants. That's about a dozen states. So they're making the case, well, if you support that, then, right, shouldn't we be supporting hardworking Americans, not undocumented immigrants? Another part of this would end any Medicaid health benefits for gender-affirming care. Another the point that the White House is making, again, saying, don't you want your taxpayer dollars to go towards hardworking Americans, not pay for somebody's transition, gender-affirming care? And so for this White House, they are saddled with trying to explain away $700 billion in Medicaid cuts and comments like from Joni Ernst about we're all going to die, with the reality that there is great consternation about the impact. One other thing I'll note, though, Katie, is that these wouldn't go into effect until after the midterm elections in late 2026. So a lot of it is talk and defense of the hardworking Americans that they are purporting to be doing these cuts on behalf of.
All right, the political risks are interesting there. That could make it much more of a next presidential election issue. Let's get to the other side of this, though, with Jillian, and that is there are a number of senators who want this to cut farther and deeper. They want not to be adding to the national debt. They've been screaming about it. How is this, as you say, a rubber meets the road moment?
This truly is a rubber hits the road moment because until now, President Trump has been able to distract people by all the dramas around Elon Musk and Doge. And of course, you've also had a lot of posturing about other issues like tariffs. And there really hasn't been a widespread scrutiny of the debt issues to the degree that many of the Republican fiscal conservatives would like to have had a long time ago. What is happening now is that he is essentially caught between a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand, you have conservatives worried about the rising debt burden, quite rightly so. You have signs that the bond market is becoming increasingly anxious about what's happening. And you could see really some quite nasty turmoil erupt in the bond market very, very easily if this isn't addressed. But at the same time, you have the growing anger amongst the populist part of the Republicans and many Democrats, of course, as well, about the cuts to welfare and Medicaid and Medicare. And so it's an almost impossible circle to square. And frankly, short of more conjuring tricks from President Trump, more distraction and more drama that takes people's eyes away from this, it's very hard indeed to see how he's possibly going to try and square this circle right now.
You say it's an impossible circle to square, but just what about raising taxes on at least some folks?
Well, of course, the obvious thing to do would be to not implement all these tax cuts, because that is what's driving up the debt above all else. And of course, Scott Bessent's been arguing for a long time, don't worry, we can grow our way out of this debt. If we get his target of 3% growth, then essentially you'll end up growing your way out of the debt. That's the theory he has. The problem is, of course, that in fact the signs are the American economy is slowing down, not growing. So you're likely to see worse and worse deficit numbers going forward, and more concern from the bond market. And it's no accident that you've got people like Steve Bannon, one of Trump's advisors, essentially calling for tax rises, not cuts on the rich, arguing that if they don't do that, you're going to get a bond market explosion and essentially a populist explosion amongst many of the MAGA base who voted for Trump in the first place.
Yeah, Donald Trump has violated every Republican taboo almost to date. It would be interesting if he doesn't violate this one. Elon Musk is also slamming it, by the way. He's saying, I'm sorry, but I just can't stand it anymore. This massive, outrageous, pork-filled congressional spending bill is a disgusting abomination. Shame on those who voted for it. You know you did wrong. You know it. Lots of questions about Elon Musk and what his role currently is and where his head's at right now. But Von Hilliard, I wonder if the White House is concerned about him. He's very deep-pocketed, and he's known, once he makes a turn, to make that turn hard against a politician who he feels has slighted him.
And he was voting for Democrats or supporting Democrats up until 2022. It was until 2022 in which he made the case that he voted for his first Republican ever. So this isn't even just about Republican on potential Republican primaries here. Elon Musk potentially trying to recruit individuals who vote for this reconciliation package, for instance. There is that threat lying underneath all of this, but also the potential of even, I know as wild as it sounds to everybody, but Elon Musk is somebody who can, on a flip of a dime, clearly switch. And if there are others, even Democrats, that are willing to carry out the types of efforts that he finds more appealing, or simply, it's Elon Musk, Katie. I think if the last months are any evidence that he is somebody here who is politically willing to put a lot on the line, even if it runs counter to what he was publicly saying just a few months prior. And so we saw him tank that agreement back in December that was struck between Republicans and Democrats. It's a question of whether there are other Republicans, even though he's no longer in Washington, who are going to follow suit and echo and use his own verbiage as justification for their no votes, whether they're in the Senate or whether this goes back to the House, and those are House members, the vote down whatever the Senate sends back their way.
Julian, do you mind just putting it to me in plain language why we should be concerned about the bond market?
Well, essentially, the bond market sets a rate in the markets at which people can borrow. So the Fed sets the official rate, the bond market sets the market rate. And essentially what's been happening is that the 10-year yield has been going up. That's critical because that's the rate for mortgages. And although the 10-year rate hasn't jumped up dramatically yet, it has gone about 4.5%. It actually has come back down again. But what you've got deep inside the bowels of the bond market are signs that there's a number of investors getting increasingly nervous about holding long-term American debt because of the risks around all of these debt issues and the fiscal issues. And the real danger right now is that if you start to see something of a buyer's strike, it can start to snowball. The fact the dollar's been weakening so much, again, it's an indication that some investors are getting quite nervous about American assets. And if the bond market crashes and yields go up, they move in opposite ways to each other. That won't just put up the price of mortgages for American households. It will also, most crucially, push up the cost of servicing the debt. And already, the cost of paying the interest on the American debt is more than the military budget. I mean, that is shocking.
Jeez, and the military budget is huge.
Exactly. So the more the rates go up, the higher the cost of actually servicing that debt. It's like having a mortgage where you reset the payments or the interest rate, and that's very dangerous.